On this Wednesday night, a fall federal election averted. The Liberals survive a confidence vote.
I vote against the motion.
I vote against.
I vote against the motion.
But can they avoid the scrutiny of the We Charity affair? COVID-19 cases rise in Alberta.
Voluntary measures will not be enough.
Why the province isn't clamping down on superspreader events. Big shift from the Catholic Church. Pope Francis's landmark declaration about same-sex unions. And pursuing support in a swing state.
Your vote doesn't just matter. It matters more than ever before.
Win Pennsylvania and potentially win the White House.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Robin Gill.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. Canadians have been spared from a snap federal election, 1 year to the day the Liberals won their second mandate. The Conservatives, despite being backed by the Bloc Québécois, have been defeated on a motion to form a special anti-corruption committee aimed at looking into pandemic spending. Reading between the lines, that includes looking into what connection the Prime Minister and his family had to We Charity, which at one point was going to run the student grant program. The Prime Minister insisted the motion would set the stage for a confidence vote and would force an election nobody wanted. Well, the nays had it, and the Liberal government is staying put. Our chief political correspondent, David Akin, is in the House of Commons tonight. David, did the NDP save Canadians from a snap election?
Well, indeed they did, Rob. And for those who did not want an election, and polls say that was a majority of Canadians, Jagmeet Singh, the NDP leader, was saying before the vote that, he thought it was absurd that the Prime Minister decided to make a motion that simply would have created a parliamentary committee into a confidence matter. It's simply never been done before. But that said, Singh and the NDP say they still believe that there are other ways to hold the government to account over their actions involving the We Charity as well as spending related to the pandemic.
We are voting for Canadians. We are voting against an election. We are going to continue to work for people. And that means continuing to hold the government to account.
Now, the Conservatives also thought that the PM had vastly overreached, declaring their motion to be a matter of confidence. Nonetheless, the Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois, as you mentioned, they voted in favour. They were on the losing side. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole, though, had this warning for the Prime Minister.
We're here to ask questions in accordance with our role as an opposition party. And we are never going to let the arrogance or entitlement of the Liberal Party to stand in our way of asking reasonable questions that Canadians want us to ask.
Now, what was Trudeau's problem? Well, he tried to argue that had this committee been created by the Conservatives, that would have paralyzed Parliament.
We don't want an election. Canadians don't want an election. But Canadians need to know that their Parliament continues to work constructively.
Now, let's talk about the We controversy. Does that go away now?
No, it does not go away, but the investigation into the We Charity and the Liberal actions gets folded, I think, into the broader considerations of other government pandemic spending. And that would include what the opposition is calling the latest scandal, and that scandal involves the awarding of a contract for ventilators, a contract worth $270 million to a Montreal company that was just recently incorporated, and one of its principals just happens to be someone who, a year ago, was in the Liberal caucus. Robin?
David Akin in Ottawa. Thanks, David. Let's bring in our Ottawa Bureau Chief, Mercedes Stephenson. Mercedes, did the Liberals actually want this election to happen?
That's a great question, Robin. Was it pandemic hardball to avoid scrutiny, or were the Liberals willing to go to an election? Well, certainly the opposition believes the Liberals wanted an election, even though we have heard Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and others deny it. At the end of the day, only the Liberals know what their true intention was here, but I can tell you that sources we've spoken to say that this aggressive and brash statement of actually taking this to a confidence vote meant the threat was real, that the government felt they were not bluffing on this and they were willing to go to the polls if they needed to. One senior Liberal source told me the Liberals felt they could do quite well on an election platform of pandemic spending, childcare and pharmacare if they did have to face Canadians.
The Liberals seemed rather confident about turning this non-confidence vote their way. Haven't they essentially backed the opposition into a corner?
Well, what mattered here was less whether the Liberals wanted an election and more the fact that they knew the opposition did not. And that's where you're getting at when you talk about backing them into a corner. Erin O'Toole, relative unknown still, and the Conservatives don't have their platform ready. The NDP have no money and run the risk of winning fewer seats. And the NDP had already publicly said as well, Robin, that they didn't think it was responsible to have an election during a pandemic. The opposition knew that Canadians would likely blame them if the government fell, even though it was the Liberals who triggered a confidence vote here. And in that case, it was something they were very wary of.
Even so, this puts the country into perpetual election threat mode. Let's remind Canadians that exactly a year ago, they voted in a minority government.
I remember where I was a year ago very well. The question here is whether the Liberals are going to keep using this strategy when they are exposed to scrutiny or to questions that they don't like. Will the government try to bully the opposition like this by threatening an election instead of opening up their books and being transparent? These confidence votes have come in a very short period of time, and it's a strategy that could become unwelcome for the Liberals if they keep going down this path.
As always, good talking to you. Mercedes Stephenson in Ottawa. To the COVID-19 pandemic now. British Columbia is reporting a record number of new cases today. For the first time, more than 200 people in that province have tested positive within 24 hours. Next door, Alberta is also setting a record with more than 400 new infections. Tonight, Premier Jason Kenney and several MLAs are self-isolating after a cabinet minister came into contact with someone who has the virus. And still, the government is relying on Albertans to take it upon themselves to limit gatherings in large groups. Premier Kenney doesn't want the province to enforce its way out. But as Heather Yourex-West explains, experts say if something isn't done soon, the health system will be in a crisis before Christmas.
Alberta's second wave of COVID-19 is approaching a critical juncture.
I would say right now we're in a danger zone where the coming weeks will really tell that story about whether we are able collectively to bend that curve downwards by following all of that guidance that's already out there.
Alberta's COVID-19 cases have been surging since early October. There are more active cases right now than during the province's previous peak in April and May. That's led to a record number of COVID-19 patients being hospitalized, with 120 hospitalizations reported last week compared to the previous high of 93 in late July.
The Royal ALEC is now reinstituting their COVID units because of the number of hospitalized patients. And as you increase the density of the virus within the hospital, you also increase the risk of outbreaks.
Outbreaks have already been declared at 4 Alberta hospitals, but within the province's big cities, the source of many infections is still not known. Contact tracers are working to track several so-called superspreader events, including a wedding that led to more than 40 people becoming sick.
At these events, COVID-19 has spread quickly and dramatically among well-meaning people.
Taking action to flatten the curve is in the hands of 4.4 million Albertans and the actions that they take as individuals, and we call upon those Albertans to exercise personal responsibility.
Alberta's premier has so far resisted calls to implement any new restrictions beyond voluntary measures that were introduced in Edmonton almost 2 weeks ago. Since then, growth has slowed, but perhaps not enough to reverse the tide.
Clearly, people are not sticking to the guidelines and numbers are rising and something has to be done. Otherwise, we will be looking at a health crisis before Christmas.
Heather Yourex-West, Global News, Calgary.
The federal government says Canada has received its first shipment of 100,000 rapid tests for COVID-19. They can deliver results in as little as 13 minutes. The tests will be sent to the provinces, but it's still not clear which ones will get them. In Toronto, there is an outbreak at St. Michael's Hospital where there are 5 active coronavirus cases among emergency room staff. The facility remains open to those needing care, but anyone who visited the ER within the last 2 weeks should self-monitor. St. Joseph's Health Centre, Toronto Western Hospital, and the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health are also dealing with COVID-19 outbreaks. Ottawa Public Health has identified 5 outbreaks involving organized sports teams. So far, there are 28 confirmed COVID-19 cases linked to these outbreaks, but hundreds of others could potentially have been exposed. Health officials say transmission took place with teams involving both adults and children. Infections have been linked to carpooling, to and from practice, sharing locker rooms, and socializing after play. In Ontario, sports teams are not allowed to play games or scrimmages. They're only permitted to practice. The Manitoba government is increasing fines for people and business owners who ignore public health orders. The fine for individuals will jump from $486 to $1,296. For businesses and corporations, the penalty will climb from just over $2,500 to $5,000. The fines apply to people who don't self-isolate when they should and businesses that exceed capacity limits. Less than 2 weeks before the U.S. election, and COVID-19 cases are surging in that country. In the past week, there have been more than 420,000 new cases, and no states are reporting any decline in infection rates. As Jackson Proskow reports, there's concern about how bad things will get, just as millions of Americans gather to vote.
The dreaded fall surge is ravaging Middle America, pushing hospitals to the brink as sick patients flood ICUs.
They are significantly more sick than the ones that we saw in the beginning of this pandemic.
Cases are on the rise or alarmingly high in most states. The U.S. is now recording nearly 60,000 new cases per day and is on course to set an all-time record for new infections in the days before the November 3rd election.
What does the situation in the U.S. look like in the beginning of November?
It looks worse than it does today because we are not taking the precautions. And as people say, we're fatigued.
People are pandemicked out. You know that? They're pandemicked out.
With more than 220,000 Americans dead and with his own job on the line, President Donald Trump has shown no interest in changing course.
Is there anything that you think you could have done differently? If you had a mulligan or a do-over on one aspect of the way you handled it, what would it be?
Not much.
Trump is still holding tightly packed rallies in COVID-19 hotspots and urging states to ease restrictions. Local officials are left to face a fractured, skeptical public.
Is this virus even a real deal? Is this the biggest hoax ever? So that's what we're dealing with.
There are no quick fixes in sight. And win or lose on November 3rd, Trump will still preside over what could be the darkest days of the pandemic in the fall and winter.
It isn't clear yet what the policies of this administration are.
Overwhelmed states are left to worry about even tougher days ahead, with their ability to cope already stretched to the limit. Jackson Proskow, Global News, Washington.
Barack Obama has hit the campaign trail in Philadelphia to support Joe Biden. The former president could be a key asset for the Democratic nominee to clinch crucial swing states. Our Mike Armstrong is in battleground Pennsylvania tonight. Mike, this is Obama's first appearance in this campaign. Why is he stepping up now?
Well, Robin, Barack Obama's plan after leaving office was to avoid politics and in particular to avoid criticizing his successor. Well, plans change.
Well,
Obama has taken part in campaign videos and TV ads with his former vice president, but tonight's rally in Philadelphia will be his first in-person event. He released a video last evening in advance.
In times as polarized as these, your vote doesn't just matter. It matters more than ever before.
The Biden campaign strategy is to use Obama to hit battleground states where early voting is already underway. Even a small bump for Biden could make a difference in some states. Here in Pennsylvania, a state with more than 6 million votes in 2016, Donald Trump won by less than 1%. Well, Trump was in Erie, Pennsylvania Tuesday night. It was at times unconventional. Trump telling the crowd he's only behind in the polls because of COVID-19.
Before the plague came in, I had it made. I wasn't coming to Erie. I mean, I have to be honest. There's no way I was coming. I didn't have to. I would have called you and said, hey, Erie, you know, if you have a chance, get out. But we had this thing won.
Now, Trump also went after Biden's roots in Pennsylvania. Biden grew up in the state, but Trump says he left when he was young and isn't really from Pennsylvania. Robin, as it turns out, we have a look at Biden's roots in this state. We visited his boyhood home in Scranton this week. That story's up later in the show.
All right, thanks for that, Mike. Mike Armstrong in Pennsylvania. The Mounties mount a defense. Coming up, the RCMP's top boss defends the response to Nova Scotia's lobster dispute. To the lobster fishing dispute in Nova Scotia now. For the first time, the RCMP's top boss is speaking publicly about the crisis that has escalated between Indigenous and commercial fishers. Commissioner Brenda Luckie says extra resources have been brought in to keep the community, caught in the middle, safe. But the Mounties are still being criticized for their response. Here's Ross Lord.
RCMP Commissioner Brenda Luckie says she wants to reassure Canadians her organization is on top of the lobster crisis.
We are fully committed to keeping the peace, keeping people safe, and enforcing the law.
That mandate has been called into question, especially after RCMP officers stood by last week as angry commercial fishers vandalized lobster pounds, forcing a Sipekne'katik First Nation harvester to barricade himself inside. The commissioner defends her organization.
We can't be in every single location, but when we are there and when we are made aware of those actions, we will step in, we will intervene.
Except, it seems, for when they don't.
I think the general consensus everywhere is that the RCMP slipped up and now it's just they're scrambling. How are they going to recover? The videos show it. RCMP standing there watching crimes being committed.
Days later, a lobster pound that did business with Indigenous fishers was destroyed by a suspected arsonist. A man considered a person of interest was sent to hospital with what RCMP called life-threatening injuries. Tensions have eased in recent days, but thorny questions remain, like how to untangle federal support for a moderate livelihood fishery from provincial law that forbids the sale of First Nations lobster because it's not licensed by Fisheries and Oceans Canada.
Well, it points at the core of the issue here is that under existing Canadian law, the activity in St. Mary's Bay is clearly illegal.
Sipekne'katik has won a legal victory of sorts, obtaining a temporary injunction against interference at the Saulnier Wharf. The wharf has become a home base for First Nations boats and supporters. Another development on the long road toward a resolution. Ross Lord, Global News, Halifax.
Purdue Pharma, the manufacturer of the powerful painkiller OxyContin, has reached a plea deal in the U.S. The drug maker pleaded guilty to 3 criminal charges for paying doctors to write more prescriptions and misleading regulators about its efforts to restrict overprescribing the drug. The company will pay the U.S. government $225 million, part of an $8 billion penalty. Purdue Pharma is blamed for sparking the deadly opioid crisis that has killed almost 500,000 people in the U.S. Still ahead, the Pope's shift on same-sex unions.
We are able to have tests who are, oh my God, there's an earthquake.
A 5.6 magnitude earthquake interrupted Iceland's Prime Minister while she was giving an interview on the impact of the pandemic on tourism. But Katrin Jakobsdottir kept her cool, quickly moving on by saying, well, this is Iceland. Pope Francis has called for the creation of civil unions for same-sex couples. His stance breaks from the Catholic Church's official teachings. The pontiff made the comments in a new documentary based on his life called Francesco. Francis says same-sex couples should be legally covered, but he stopped short of advocating for legalized marriage. The Pope says homosexual people have the right to be in a family. They are children of God. Italy was the last country in Western Europe, other than Vatican City, to offer same-sex couples legal rights. Africa's largest city is under a strict and indefinite curfew after weeks of protests against police brutality in Nigeria. But demonstrators are showing their defiance even in the face of gunfire. Amnesty International says it's investigating credible evidence that multiple people were killed yesterday. Witnesses reported seeing uniformed men shooting into the crowds. Demonstrations first broke out 2 weeks ago over alleged abuse by the country's now disbanded Special Anti-Robbery Squad. The government is vowing to restore order. Up next, sowing the seeds in Scranton. Can Biden grow support from his Pennsylvania roots? Pennsylvania has emerged as a swing state that could be a factor in the outcome of the U.S. presidential election. In 2016, Donald Trump won Pennsylvania's 20 electoral college votes in a narrow victory that paved his way to the White House. But his rival, Joe Biden, grew up there. And as Mike Armstrong explains, the Democrat is determined to win his home state.
It's not on any tourism websites, but this home may be someday. The reason people stop for pictures is that the wood-slatted house on Scranton's Washington Avenue was the boyhood home of a man who may be the next president, Joe Biden.
Hey, buddy, how are you?
Biden hasn't forgotten this home. He dropped by on the campaign trail this summer.
It's time for a few questions. No, I just came to see Ann.
Now, that Ann he wanted to see is the new homeowner. Sort of. It's hard to call Ann Kearns new, considering she raised a family in the home and has lived in it for close to 6 decades.
He's been here now, I think, about 11, 12 times.
Kearns has documented some of those trips, including the first one. Biden brought his 91-year-old mother. In 2016, he popped by with journalists in tow and then presidential candidate Hillary Clinton.
Hi! How are you?
This is Ann.
The goal of that visit was to help Clinton in central Pennsylvania. It didn't work.
Donald Trump's victory in this state in 2016 by the slimmest of margins was thanks to votes he picked up in rural and blue-collar communities. This time around, Joe Biden's playing up his blue-collar roots just about every chance he gets.
I view this campaign, as I've said before and I'll say it again, between Scranton and Park Avenue.
Biden only lived in Scranton until he was 10. His family moved away in 1953 as part of a massive exodus when the steel mills closed.
I like the guy.
Now, it's not hard to find Scrantonians who are proud of Biden, but there are those who say he's trying to take advantage of shallow roots.
I knew Joe when we were kids.
Did you really?
Yeah, at the Greenridge Pizza, we went in there for pizza. But Joe left, and Joe never came back.
Well, he's come back enough for visits that the Kearns family regrets a change they made years ago. As a boy, Biden had carved "Joe was here" in the molding of this window.
We, not knowing he was going to be vice president someday, had removed that. So when he was here, we said, you know, we'd love it if you re-signed the old home. So that was where Joe signed.
On top of everything else that's on the line in this election, there's even more for the Kearns family. The next 2 weeks will determine whether the house eventually becomes an official tourist attraction. Mike Armstrong, Global News, Scranton, Pennsylvania.
And that is Global National for this Wednesday. I'm Robin Gill. Tonight, your Canada is the Harbour in Victoria, BC. We'd love to see your corner of the country, so send us your photos to viewers@globalnational.com. Thank you for watching. Donna Friesen will be back here tomorrow, and I'll see you this weekend. Have a great night.